So let's continue where we left off. We'll add in some fillet details, and I have one more Boolean to put into the volume knob. So right now, if we go to rendered mode, Control-Alt-R, you notice we have some very sort of hard edges here. Let me go back to shaded mode. So we're going to put a fillet on these edges, and then we're going to put a very small fillet on this back edge, because when you have a molded plastic, you never have a truly pure 90-degree angle. There's always a slight fillet on there. And just putting a little fillet makes sure things look much more realistic in renderings. So we'll come in and we'll do fillet edge. And I think 1's going to be a little too large for this little edge. Remember, we offset that 1 to begin with, so that's going to put a radius that comes almost all the way to the inside, so that won't work. So let's just make that a 0.75 millimeter. So I'll type 0.75 and hit enter. I can select that. And I can select that. I'll hit enter. And I have preview set to yes, so it's giving me a little preview of what's going to go on here. That looks about right. And notice we have a little bit of an edge left in the back here, and that's going to give us room to put our little fillet edge on the back surface there. I'll hit enter. And that looks good. I'll just apply the command again by hitting the space bar. This time I'll type 0.2. We'll see if that'll fit. So I'll select that back edge and that back edge. Hit enter again. Now if I look at this, as long as I've got a slight gap here, I know that should work. And the same here. As long as my preview is showing me a slight gap, then that should all work out. So I don't see any strange surfaces there. Let's temporarily bring back our antenna and our volume knob, and we'll zoom in. So now that we're zoomed in, let's switch to our render mode. So again, Control-Alt-R. And notice this doesn't look very good. Now the data itself is actually good. If I go to wireframe mode, Control-Alt-W, and select these and turn back on our isocurves, I can zoom all the way in here. You see they're nice and smooth. Let me select that and switch off the isocurves again. Again, Control-Alt-S for shaded mode. So all we're seeing here is that our render mesh settings are set a little too low. And we can change that by, again, I like to get in there very fast by just right-clicking. That takes me right into my Rhino menu. And then we'll go up to our mesh. And sure enough, we're set to jagged and faster. I'm just going to select custom. And yours may look like this. It may look a little different. If it looks like this, then you're going to click on detailed controls. And this is where we want to be. So for a consumer product, I always like to use these following settings. I'll set all of these to 0. The maximum distance edge to surface, I'll set to 0.01. And then the minimum initial grid quads, I'm going to set to 16. And all we're adjusting there is how this surface is triangulated when we see a shaded version of it. Remember, in 3D, everything is cut up into tiny little triangles. We never see them because the software sort of hides that from us. So anytime you see any sort of a shaded or rendered objects, it's actually cut into probably thousands or millions of little triangles. Now notice how jagged this is. When I hit OK, you can see it jump and it cleans up right away. And the same when I go into our render mode here. Notice we get just that little bit of shadow, and this render mode doesn't show the real shadows that well in here, but we get a nice little shadow detail happening there, and it makes this look that much more realistic. So that's it for the fillets on this edge. Let's just do one more thing. We're going to do that to this volume knob. What we want to do is put some little knurled cutaways in here to make it easier to grip, and that's very, very easy to do. All we're going to do is actually just use an ellipse. So we'll choose ellipsoid from center. Now where it's asking us for the ellipsoid center, I'm going to select a round curve. And I'm going to select the curve, and I happen to have this edge here, which is where we drew our cross section. It's not the actual cross section itself, it's actually part of the surface, but I can select a surface edge. And I want to move this up until this is about halfway between where the purple housing is and before the fillet starts. So about there is good. I'm going to hold my shift down, and this is my first radius of my ellipse going that way. And now we're going to do the ellipse going this direction. And then the next one states how tall the ellipse is. It's going to follow this curve because of the command we have applied. So it's a very handy curve for something like this. So that's really embedded in there. I do want to move that out a little bit, but notice if I grab, maybe you might see this in the front view, might look a little easier. There we go. So if we're in our front view and I grab this with my gumball selected, notice how the gumball still wants to move in relation to the actual C-plane or the ground plane. So let me show you what happens when I move this. It's going to come out of here sort of unevenly. It's going to start to lower it down into the object. It's going to move vertically down because of the rounded shape of this. So I can change that by right-clicking on this little white circle, and I can select Align to Object. Now when I do that, notice my gumball changes. So now when I move it, we're moving up. We're moving perpendicular to the line. So I can just kind of move this out a little bit. Seems pretty good there. You never really know until you actually go ahead and cut the holes with something like this. But I think that seems pretty good. So I want to use this to cut out a whole bunch of these around the object. So we're going to do what's called a polar array. I have this selected. I'm going into my transform menu, and this icon right here is the polar array. It's asking me for the center, and I can choose that right in my perspective view. I've got my end snap on. I'm going to snap right at the center of this because we spun everything around to create this volume knob right from there. Number of items it's asking me. Right now it's the default is 2. I want to increase that. Let's try 8 and see what that looks like. And we want to fill a full 316 is the next question. I'll hit yes. And we're still in the command, so be very careful. And it's showing me a preview of what that's going to look like. I want to add a few more, so I'll go to items equals, click on that, and let's type 10. Let's make that 12. I'll do that again. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. So I'll hit yes, and now that's giving me a whole bunch there. I think that looks nice. Now I don't want to have to go through and individually select all of these to make a Boolean. So what I can do is under the select menu, and I use this all the time, I love it now, I can choose select last created object. So that picks everything that was just created. Now it doesn't pick the source piece, so it doesn't select this piece for me. So I do have to manually hold down Shift, select that. But now I have all of those parts, and I can hit Control G, and now I've grouped them together. So if I deselect that, I can select them. Now I won't have to individually select all these parts. So we'll do a Boolean difference to cut these in there. I'll select this object. We'll go under our Booleans. We'll select difference. Delete input. I'm going to set that to yes. That way I'll get rid of these after we've used them. I just click on these. I'll hit enter. And notice it deletes all of them for me. Zoom out a little. We'll do Control-Alt-R to render this. Looks pretty good. I think they're a little harsh looking right now. So let me go into my front view. I'm just going to put a little fillet edge on these. I'll switch to shaded mode, Control-Alt-S. And I'm going to choose a fillet, but I'm not going to click on each individual part. Let me show you with fillet. Once I choose it, I can actually just drag a selection. So I can drag a box, and I know because these are all the same height that I can drag the box around all of them. Now that's probably a little too small of a fillet, so 0.2. So let's try 0.5 and see what that looks like. And I think that looks pretty good. Let me jump out to the perspective view and make sure the ones in the back aren't going off into space somewhere crazy. And that looks pretty good, I think. So I'll hit enter. And it's going to think about that for just a little while. Now this is leaving me with a whole bunch of my isocurves on, and you know I don't like that. So I'm just going to select everything, go to Properties, and I'll uncheck this box. That'll switch all the isocurves off. Again, that's just in my view, though. It doesn't change anything on the data. And I'll show these in rendered mode. And that looks much, much better, I think. So that completes our look at adding Boolean and fillet edge details.